Hi and welcome to the channel. If you register your Moog Grandmother in the website, you get access to a collection of patches designed by Lisa Bella Donna. And in this video, I'll try to unpack with you one of the patches from her collection to try to answer the question, can we learn techniques, tips and tricks from one synthesizer and apply it to a complete other platform? That's a claim that you hear in many channels, including my own. So I wanted to put this to test. But before we deep dive, a few disclaimers here. I'll split this video in roughly two parts. One where I explore the Moog patch, and in the second part I will try to reproduce or use the lessons learned from Moog onto the Hydrasynth. Okay, so let's try to unpack this patch together. This patch was designed to be used as an arpeggiator. Therefore, if I hold a chord, you can hear how the pattern evolves and plays several notes. So this is a generative patch, right? The notes you play will create more notes and you have all of these evolving patterns. So the core of this patch here, it's actually a clever use of the envelope to create this dynamic movement throughout the harmony that you play here in the arpeggiator. And how is this done? You can see here that the arpeggiator is set to a forward motion in 3 octaves, but there is a patch coming from the arpeggiator gate into the modulation section. What this is doing is resetting the modulation wave every time a note is triggered by the keyboard. But the patch gets really interesting with all the dynamic modulation that is going on here. First and foremost, let's have a look at the envelope. You can see that the values in the attack decay release here are pretty extreme, and you can see at the output that the keyboard is set to keyboard release, meaning that the gate triggers will bypass the envelope and use only the release value, ignoring both attack and decay. So you have a slight different behavior from the envelope modulation to the amplifier and what the envelope is doing here onto the filter. So you can see, although I have a very long attack, if I play, the sound comes in from the beginning. But that's not all. What is going on here when you see this crescendo in the volume, but here is an interesting modulation that I've never tried before, which is taking the wave from oscillator 2 all the way into the amplifier VCA amount. And what this does is to create an amplitude modulation of the VCA. Now let's have a look at the modulation section here. The modulation wave is set to square wave, and this is routed to the pulse width modulation, but also the cutoff frequency going up and down at the rate of the lead here. But look how interesting. She's patching the wave out from the modulation section into the attenuator, and you would expect when patching wave out that the meaning is to use the LFO as an oscillator, but the rates here are still very low. But what she does instead is to send the signal from the attenuator into the oscillator to pitch. So actually the LFO, it's doing a pitch modulation into the oscillator too. But okay, let's have a look at the oscillator module, so we try to understand the sound design here. She's using both oscillators, but oscillator 1 is in a square wave since it's being modulated with pulse width, and oscillator 2, it's in triangle, so it has a smoother sound. Notice that oscillator 1, it's tuned to 16, whereas oscillator 2 is tuned 3 octaves higher, and that's what gives us this bright sound when the modulation is on. And it's even clearer when you go higher up on the key. Then oscillator 1 here is routed to the high pass filter and then back to the mixer on the oscillator 1 knob. So if we look at the mixer section, basically oscillator 1 that has the bass sound has a higher volume, oscillator 2 stays in the background, and there is some noise to add texture. On the utility section, as I said, we have a high pass filter for oscillator 1, but the attenuator is actually used as a fine tuning for oscillator 2 since it's modulating oscillator 2 pitch here. If we now look at the filter section, in conjunction with the envelope here, the frequency there is very low, having this darker sound, but the tracking to the keyboard is in a proportion in 1 to 2, meaning that the higher notes we played, the more open the filter will be. Right? But you have to remember, this filter here is also being modulated by the pulse wave in the LFO. And this is actually regulated by the mod wheel here. So you can actually open and close the filter using the mod wheel. Let's have a look. And now it's even clearer what oscillator 2 is doing in the background. But if we look back to the envelope here, I think this is the core of this patch. This is the heart of this patch. And the whole evolving sequence here happens because of these very extreme values in attack, decay, release, and sustain. And the negative envelope is also routed back to help on modulating pulse width here for oscillator 1. So you don't get only the traditional LFO modulation here, but the pattern gets even more complex because you have this very long time envelope varying, creating this additional texture in the pulse width. So what we have here is the patch that I made in Hydrasynth based on the lessons I've learned from Lisa Bella Donna's patch on the Moog Grandmother. If you are interested on recreating this patch in your Hydrasynth, you can follow me while I show you the parameters now. But if you just want to see the final result, you can skip this chapter and see how the patches sound in the end. So if we want to reproduce a sound of a monophonic analog synth, we can start on the voicing here by changing polyphony to monophonic. And I like to add the analog FL. In my case here, sweet spot was 87, and turn the warm mode on. The other thing you want to do for that generative patch is to turn your arpeggiator on. And the values I have set was the mode to go up on 3 octaves on a division of 1 to 32 and a swing of 75. So now let's have a look onto our sound sources here. If we look at the mixer, I've tried to mimic the Moog patch by setting oscillator 1, which is our low pitch oscillator, to a value of 100, and oscillator 2, that will be our high pitch oscillator, to a value of 26. I have added ring modulation here with a value of 100 and set the noise volume to about 58. So let's have a look at the sound sources here, starting by oscillator 1. Oscillator 1 is set to square because we want to modulate it with pulse width. And the way you do that in the Hydra is by adding a mutant. So mutant 1 here is set to pulse width modulation. I added 70% of feedback, let the ratio to 1, decrease the depth to about 35, but let the signal wet. If we now look at oscillator 2, this one is set to triangle, just like in the Moog patch. 3 octaves above, so semi set to 36, with also a big detuning of 28 cents, just like in the Moog. And I let the key track to 100%. On the noise here is where I added a little bit of Hydra Spice by choosing a red noise and the ring modulation to 64, ring volume to 100 like we saw in the mixer, and the noise volume 58 just like the mixer. Again, trying to simulate the Moog sound here. On filter 1, I've used a low pass filter, ladder filter 24 dB per octave, with a sweet spot in my cutoff here of around 53, and a high resonance level on 62. And on the key track, since in the Moog it was configured to follow in a proportion to 1 to 2, my sweet spot here ended up around 37% for the low pass filter cutoff key track. If you remember, on the Moog patch, she also used the high pass filter only for oscillator 1. I cannot route the filter 2 here only to oscillator 1, but if we look at filter 2, on the type here, I use this hybrid band pass, but if you set the morph value to 128, it will behave only as a high pass filter. My cutoff sweet spot around 83 here. No resonance and no key track, just like on the Moog, where you don't have these options. My amplifier value, if you want to reproduce, is 75, and this is where the differences starts with the Moog. If you remember, on the Moog patch, she have set the VCA mode to keyboard release, meaning that the envelope that controls the amplifier volume only had parameters for sustain and release. And the way I mimic this here in the Hydra is by using envelope 2 as my amplifier envelope, since those are pre-routed already. And as you can see here, I zeroed my attack and decay time, kept sustain to a level of 110, and a very long release time of 28 seconds, based on the Moog patch. But to represent the envelope in the Moog, I ended up using my last envelope here, envelope 5, and that one is set more similar to what you see on the patch there, with a very long attack time of 6 seconds, decay time set to 12, sustain value to 90, and a release value to 7 seconds. If I would do exactly like the Moog, I should copy sustain and release values from that envelope, but I kept it like this. It sounded good. And then if we now look at the modulation session, I have used LFO 5 to represent the LFO in the Moog. And this was set to a square wave at a rate of about 5.1 Hertz. And this is how you reset the LFO using the key on the Hydrasynth. So you should set your trigger sync to single here, and this will do the exact same as the patch she did from the keyboard control onto the sync in the Moog to give you that responsive modulation in relation to the keyboard. And I set my level here all the way to 128. So this is more or less the knobbing configuration in the Moog. But the magic happened when she started to patch the cables. And the way to do this in the Hydrasynth is on the mod matrix. So let's see how I patched it up here. So if we look here at my first patch, I have assigned as a source envelope 5 and the destination to mutant 1, which is my pulse width modulation of oscillator 1. And this represents the cable going from the negative envelope values in the Moog into pulse width modulation patch bay in oscillator 1. If we now look at my second routing here, I have routed the LFO onto the same parameter of pulse width. And this represents the knob pulse width in the Moog modulation section. My third routing here was from envelope 5 into the low pass filter cutoff, filter 1 here. And what this represents is the envelope amount knob on the Moog filter section. If I now go to page 2, you should remember that this patch is full of cables. I've also routed LFO 5, or modulation in the Moog, onto oscillator 2 pitch. And this was all the routing she did going through the attenuator from the modulation wave amount out and back to the oscillator 2 pitch. I don't need to use an attenuator here because when we route the parameters in the Hydra, you can actually set this amount. And this tuning here, negative tuning, is of my own taste, what I thought sounded better in my patch. But this is where I encounter difficulties here, because on a Moog, you have an output for the oscillator wave, and this is represented by the source row here in my mod matrix. But if you look the options you have here in the Hydra, you cannot select an oscillator as a source. So my thinking was, what if I use LFO 4 to mimic how the wave of oscillator 1 was in the original patch? So let's see how this looks like on LFO 4 here. You can see here that I set the LFO to a square wave, just like oscillator 1. Hey, this is me from editing here. Well, the LFO 4 was actually mimicking the oscillator 2, meaning that the waveform, the correct waveform, was triangular. So just follow the recipe down there and you should be fine. I will correct myself down the road, but just bear with me. It's a triangular wave. Also triggering in single mode, but I let the rate in 1 here. So if we go back to the mod matrix, what I tried to do was, okay, I will route the LFO into my amp level, and this is me trying to represent the cable that she takes from wave out in oscillator 2 all the way to the VCA amount in on the amplifier section. And in order to try to make this LFO to act as an oscillator, I have assigned the key track to LFO for rate to the maximum level. So if you follow me here, let me know what you think of my workaround. I think that the final result sounded nice, but if you know a way to get an oscillator wave as a source for the mod matrix, please let me know in the comments. If we now go to page 3, this is just me playing with Hydra here and routing polyphonic aftertouch to my low pass filter cutoff. You don't need that step if you don't want to. Last but not least, I have added a reverb because in the Moog Grandmother you have the spring reverb. And since I didn't have a spring reverb here, could use plate, but I have chosen cloud because I think it sounds more dramatic and it matches the cinematic characteristic of a generative patch. The values for my delay here are pretty high, 38.5 milliseconds on pre-delay and a time of 6 seconds. I also try to fine-tune the tone here, leaving high and low damp as they were and setting the wet to 65%. So if you followed me that far, I think now it's time to show how this patch sounds. To round off a little here with you, if you ask me, does the two patches sound exactly the same? Being plain honest with you, I don't think they do. But as I was doing this patch, I was also thinking, what's the point to find a sweet spot to make the Hydra sound exactly like the Moog? But if I think about the big picture, I am not a modular synth expert, and particularly I was not so into the generative patches before, but I had so many aha moments on the creative modulations that she has done there in the Moog, and I really wanted to try to put to the test that concept. Can I actually learn lessons from one synthesizer and apply into the other? Can I actually say this to you in the channel? Hey, you can do this in any synthesizer. And for that matter, I actually think I was pretty successful. I think the atmosphere around the two patches are very similar, or the purpose for what you use them musically are very similar. But of course, the way the modulation routing is designed in one system and the other, it's really difficult to find two platforms that will give you exactly the same possibilities. But in any case, the clever usage of the modulation can be applied. And then what I try to do is to spice it up to sound more like Hydrasynth. The same as in the Moog, you get all the characteristics of having an analog spring reverb there, which is really difficult to mimic in another synth, right? What do you think? Have you tried to make this patch on your Hydra? I have for sure saved this one on my personal library here, and I hope soon I can apply this musically. And I had a lot of fun on trying to do this exercise. I hope it was fun for you as well to watch. As always, thanks for watching.